are here to help us break down a little bit more of everything that's happening with the Israel-Hamas war and get more of an understanding about Palestine and the region overall is Zachary Foster. He's a historian of Palestine. You can go visit PalestineNexus.com. Zachary, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having us.
You know, Zachary, it's so apropos and fitting right now. We've been covering a lot of this war. We've had a UCLA professor on of Israel studies, Dov Waxman, who's written a book about this conflict. We're going to get into if we should even be using the word conflict, because I know you said something about that on Twitter recently. So I want to get your takeaways on that. But first, overall, just at a high level for you, you've been so vocal on Twitter about everything that's happening in the region and has happened historically. 30,000-foot overview for you, October 7th to now, and everything that's kind of happened with the war, proportional response, whether it is or isn't, by Israel, the everyday Gazans that are going through this right now. What do you make of everything that's happened so far since October 7th?
Well, I think if we start the story on October 7th, we won't be able to understand what happened on October 7th, because October 7th was a response to a 16-year-long blockade and siege on Gaza. It was a response to 5 wars Israel waged on Gaza, during which time Israel killed something like 3,000 innocent Palestinians. It's a response to the fact that 90% of people in Gaza lack access to safe drinking water. It's a response to the fact that there's a 50% unemployment rate in Gaza and that 80% of people are dependent on food handouts, and a response to a mental health crisis and a sewage crisis and an electricity crisis. So I think without talking about those things, you won't understand what happens on October 7th. But if we want to start the story on October 7th, you know, Hamas infiltrates Israel, and slaughters something like 1,200, maybe 1,300 by now, I think is the official count, most of them Israeli civilians, as well as some Israeli military personnel. And in response, Israel started to drop bombs on Gaza almost immediately. And I think Israel has killed something like 3,000 Palestinians, maybe more by this point. So that's kind of at a high level what has happened. And maybe I'll pause there and you can kind of take this discussion whichever direction you like.
To that end, I mean, what you're speaking to, of course, brings up, you know, you're talking about sort of history, what leads up to October 7th. You know, sometimes one thing we've noticed is, I wouldn't say it's necessarily conflation, but sort of talking about two things at the same time, and you know whether that seems appropriate. Which is, one is what's going on in Gaza, and then two, the motivations of Hamas. Critics of talking about one allege that you're laying sympathies then toward the other. Is that a fair estimate, though? Like, if, for example, when we talk about Hamas, is that representative of the feelings? Like, does that organization represent truly the feelings for all Palestinians? Or what we saw recently on October 7th, is Hamas essentially operating in isolation, not necessarily representative of the needs or the wants of the Palestinian people?
Hamas was elected in 2006, in January 2006. Okay, so that's what, 17 years ago. The majority of Palestinians in Gaza are under the age of 18. Okay, so not only did they not vote for Hamas, but they weren't even alive when Hamas came into power. Okay, and there's not really any accurate polling, I would say, coming out of Gaza, because the fact is Hamas is an autocratic regime. There has been no free and fair democratic election since 2006. And so, and it's also, I would say, a brutal regime, right? They arrest political opponents. They execute anyone they believe is collaborating with Israel, or even members of Fatah who they just don't like for, you know, for political reasons. And so it's very hard to get accurate numbers. I think most people in Gaza, I was just recently in Gaza, by the way, a couple of weeks ago. Most people I met in Gaza, I think, have the same desires and goals as you and me. They want to have a family. They want to raise their kids and find a great job and live a great life. I mean, that's the majority of people everywhere around the world. I don't think Gaza is any exception. I think one thing I would point out, however, is that when you've been confined to a 22-mile by 5-mile piece of land that most analysts describe as an open-air prison, when you can't have a normal economy because you're living under siege, you can't import or export anything, when you can't travel anywhere, you can't leave. You know, the vast majority of Gazans have never left Gaza. Okay. When these are the circumstances and the conditions of your life, obviously you're going to support resistance to that blockade and that siege, right? So I think at a high level, I don't know very many Palestinians that oppose resisting Israel at a conceptual level. They reject occupation and they support resistance to that occupation and that siege. Do they support Hamas? Honestly, it's your guess is as good as mine. Like I said, I'm not aware of any accurate polling data, but what I would add as well is that whenever there's a military clash between Israel and Gaza, the polling that we do have suggests that Hamas experiences a surge in popularity, right? And so I think if Israel had the belief going into this war that somehow killing 3,000 innocent Palestinian civilians was going to somehow make them more popular among Gaza and somehow make Hamas less popular, I think they're sadly mistaken. All the evidence suggests that when you slaughter innocent Palestinians in Gaza, people rally around the government and they rally around resistance for the same reasons that people rally around the government in Israel when Israel faces a slaughter. Of course, we just saw in Israel, by the way, after the attack, there was a unity government was formed between Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu. Okay, that would have been unthinkable only a few weeks ago. I mean, these are sworn enemies of Netanyahu who said they would never sit in a government with him, and here they are, on October 10th or 11th, sitting in a government with the person who is their sworn enemy. So, again, like I would say that. So I'll maybe leave it at that.
Zachary, there's so much there that I can follow up on, but I heard you whispering out, or actually saying out, a couple of different terms there. And one of the things we like to do here is inform and educate, right? Like we're trying to learn more about it. We don't have a proverbial dog in this fight. So as you were saying some of the things there about Hamas and their political opponent back in 2006, that they killed a lot of folks of that side of that party. I would love for you to kind of explain some of these organizations and just how everyday Gazans, you just said you were there a few weeks ago, can't move freely. Explain why they can't move freely. So give us a little bit of the background of how Hamas came to be, and then of the everyday plight of these folks that live in Gaza, that they can't go to Egypt because everyone has been talking about, well, Israel's having all these airstrikes in the north. They're telling people to leave. Where are they going to go? You just described it's not that big of a place. So take us a little bit more inside, not only your visit and recounting some of that, but also historically, like just they can't go anywhere. Explain why.
Yeah, so the Gaza Strip is a very small place. Okay, like I said, it's something like 22 miles by 5 miles, and so it's a rectangular shape, right? And so in 2006, there were elections. There were Palestinian elections, and the main two parties in that election were Fatah and Hamas. Okay, Fatah was represented by Yasser Arafat, who led that political party for 40, 50 years. When he died in the early 2000s, Mahmoud Abbas took over. And really for, I would say, really from, the 80s, 90s, and all the way through the early 2000s, really Fatah dominated Palestinian politics. It was basically a kind of a one-party the PLO had the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was this umbrella organization founded in 1964 that included a ton of different Palestinian groups, militant and otherwise. But Fatah was really the dominant one because that was the party of Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the PLO for many decades. And so that organization signed the Oslo Accords with Israel in 1993, which was a series of agreements in which Israel was theoretically supposed to be transferring over sovereignty of parts of the Palestinian occupied territories to the Palestinian Authority. As part of the Oslo Accords, there was also the establishment of a Palestinian National Council, the PNC, which was a legislative body, which, always in theory, was supposed to be a governing body for these newly parts of the Palestinian occupied territories that would get self-rule. So that's kind of the basic background to these 2006 elections. And, from Hamas's origins in the 1970s to 2006, Hamas stayed out of politics. From 73 to 88, they were an apolitical organization. They were an Islamic charity. They focused on giving money to schools, building clinics, supporting orphanages, religious preaching. They were a religious Islamic charity organization. They became much more radical beginning in 1987 when Israel brutally suppressed the first Intifada, as it's known, the uprising. in which Palestinians mostly resisted Israeli rule nonviolently with protests and strikes and boycotts. And it was in the first year of the Intifada from late 1987 until 1988, which really radicalized Hamas. During that first year of the uprising, Israel killed 142 Palestinians in Gaza, and Palestinians killed 0 Israelis. And I think that grotesque violence, that brutality, is what radicalized Hamas. In late 1988, they embraced this charter that says we're gonna, we call for the destruction of Israel. And throughout the 90s, they came to all these heinous terrorist attacks against innocent Israelis in buses and cafes. So they were pretty much stayed out of the Oslo process. They rejected any type of negotiation with Israel. They deemed Israel illegitimate. And so they stayed out of politics. By 2006, I think there was a change in thinking in the Hamas leadership, which was we can have a bigger impact within the institutions that came out of the Oslo process than we can sitting on the sidelines outside of official Palestinian political organizations. And so they put forward candidates during this election. And I think most people, expected Fatah to win. No one expected Hamas to win. It was a surprise victory, and it was they won by a narrow margin too, right? It wasn't like an overwhelming victory. It was quite a narrow margin. Nevertheless, they won, and so they defeat Fatah at the polls in January 2006, and then over the course of that year, the Fatah representatives who are kind of in control of Gaza. At least from the inside, right? There's still an Israeli occupation that controls the airspace and the groundwater and controls the telecommunication networks and the electricity, right? Israel is still in control of Gaza, but it's transferring over some amount of self-rule within Gaza, right? Who collects the garbage? And now it's Palestinians rather than Israeli military officials deciding that. Who cleans the streets? Who runs the school system? Who does all the civilian manages the civilian affairs of Gaza is now transferred over to this Palestinian Authority. But the problem was in 2006, Fatah refused to give up power. They lost the election, but they didn't leave office, and so Hamas takes power by force. Call it a coup, call it their legitimate right to take power because they won the election. Call it whatever you want, but they took power in 2006. And Israel, as well as the United States and the European Union and Canada and Australia and Japan, all consider Hamas a terrorist organization. And so there was this consensus, basically, this international consensus to basically blockade Hamas. And so Israel, starting in 2007, imposes a land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip. And by 2010, Israel had, the UN had deemed that blockade was illegal under international law because it was imposing collective punishment on 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, this blockade was brutal. People forget this, but there was a leaked report that came out that showed that Israel was calculating the number of calories needed by each person. So they calculated the number of people in Gaza and how many calories each person needed per day to survive, and they gave and they allowed just slightly more than that of food to enter Gaza. So they called it they were putting Gazans on a diet. Okay, this is Israeli language, by the way. So, Israel imposes brutal blockade on Gaza that was deemed illegal because it was imposing collective punishment on millions of people, and because Israel's stated goal at the time was to punish the people of Gaza for electing Hamas. So they themselves basically admitted there was no military goal here. The point of the blockade was not to it was also to prevent, let's say rockets from entering Gaza, which they could have done without a blockade. But the point ultimately was to punish the people. And so anyways, that blockade has persisted to the present. And so you have, 2.3 million Palestinians who have been living under a state of blockade and siege their entire lives. So I think I can't actually remember the question you asked, but I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you answered it perfectly because I wanted really the historical lens and kind of how this organization came to be, which I think a lot of people don't know about in 2006 of them actually taking things back by force and why Western nations have now labeled them as a terrorist organization. Let me actually follow up real quick on this point because for the people that are listening, and like I mentioned in the previous episode we had, or 2 episodes ago, we had the Israel studies professor from UCLA, Dov Waxman. He wrote a book, The Israel-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. And, a lot of the reaction and sentiments that we got from folks that are, Jewish or have family in Israel or Israeli, was this was great. There was a real look at the Israeli faults and the Palestinian faults. I want to kind of pose the same question to you, because to somebody listening to this that now sees the actions of Hamas, and there's a famous clip of Senator Bernie Sanders saying it's not anti-Semitic to criticize a right-wing government in Israel. Same thing, like it's not, you're not against the people of Gaza if you criticize the actions of Hamas and this bloodshed that they have done. I would love for you to kind of break down, what do you say to someone that maybe has gotten into you on social media saying, hey, you're not taking what Hamas did to Israel and responding like you should. It's a terrorist act. Of course, you can deem that terrorist and look at the violence, but you can also, like you mentioned before, kind of predate some of that, of why we are where we are. So what do you make of that dichotomy between being able to separate Hamas being a terrorist organization and not representative of the people of Gaza? You were just there a few weeks ago, versus the same thing in Israel, where Bibi's government is not representative of the way Israelis feel.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's obviously possible to say what Hamas did is atrocious and that it's an atrocity and that we should condemn it, just as we should condemn the killing of all innocent life. At the same time, it's also possible to say Israel has been imposing a 56-year-long brutal military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and it's and it's been imposing a 16-year siege on and a blockade on Gaza, and it's killed 3,000 innocent Palestinians over the past 16 years in Gaza. All those things are correct. There's no contradiction in saying any of those things. Unfortunately, we live in a society today that is incredibly polarized. I've certainly never felt more polarization today than in the past. We can talk about the reasons for that. I think social media plays a huge role. I think the algorithm feeds us what we want, and enragement equals engagement. And so we're just pushed it further and further to the extremes. Look, I myself, I tweet something kind of nuanced, like, more analysis rather than like a hot political take. Nobody cares. I tweet, this is a genocide. Everyone's agreeing all the genocide scholars are calling this a genocide. You have 26 statements from Israeli political and military leaders that are essentially espousing genocide. They're espousing genocidal intent. But it's that stuff that does well on social media. It's the more extreme views. The more, you post a picture of a 2-year-old Palestinian girl, Fatima, who I posted this a month or two ago, a Palestinian girl who was denied an exit permit from Gaza because she couldn't get the medical treatment she needed in Gaza. And Israel, of course, denied her a medical permit, as it does the vast majority of Gazans who seek medical treatment outside of Gaza, because they can't get it in Gaza because there's a siege and a blockade. And so they can't get the needed medical treatment they need there. So they apply for the exit permit. They're denied in the vast majority of cases, they're denied. And this one girl, this 2-year-old Fatima girl, died as a result. And she's not unique. There are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians in the same situation as her. You tweet that, and it creates this outrage. Oh my God, Israel's killing innocent babies. This is an outrage. Thousands of retweets, right? I mean, but if you say something more nuanced, like, Israel, has legitimate security needs, and Hamas has been importing rockets into Gaza for the past 20 years. And so it's legitimate that Israel, is going to impose some degree of controls around what goes in and out of Gaza. And you have a nuanced take, and no one's going to care about that.
Zachary, to that end, and you just the idea about social media, we've noticed that, and it's not so much about being critical of the new ownership at X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, but when we compare the coverage at the time of, in the U.S., for example, of the Boston Marathon bombing or the Arab Spring in 2009, where there was more of a presence of fact-checking journalists and such discussing and really providing informed perspective on what's going on. What's your read of where social media is right now? You just talked about polarization. Are we at a place where the tools that we found previously to be more helpful than sometimes even mainstream media could offer, are we now at a place where that's becoming less available to us? And really, social media is just feeding into a time of not time, but into disinformation that's making things even more polarized and producing less informed people.
Yeah, I think it's easy. It's easy to talk about the disinformation and the polarization and all the other problems of social media. I think it's what I didn't say is that I myself wouldn't be on this podcast right now if it weren't for social media. Social media has been an incredible empowerment to me personally, and probably to you guys as well. How is it that I'm able to get my voice out? You think the New York Times cares what I have to say? You think the Washington Post cares what I have to say? No, they're going to go interview some, political analyst who's at a Washington think tank, or some ex-diplomat who was the ambassador to Israel or whatever else. Those are so it's entrenched, established powers that be that benefit from the old system. And it's sort of, independent scholars, independent thinkers, people who just read and want to share what they have to say, like me. I don't have any official positions. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not even a professor. I'm nothing. I'm just a dude. And so social media has been incredibly empowering to me personally. So I think it's easy to point out the problems. I think, we forget that, we forget the optimism we all had for social media 15, 20 years ago. I think when these platforms first emerged, remember you yourself just brought up the Arab Spring. There was a tremendous amount of optimism. In fact, people were pointing to social media as one of the key elements that led to the Arab Spring in the first place. And so, look, social media is, it's a beast. It empowers everybody. I think there are some things we can do to kind of tamp down the misinformation. I think, first of all, the platforms need to pay an algorithmic tax, which is to say that they're media companies, just like New York Times and CNN and Fox News are media companies, because they decide what I see, just like CNN and Fox News decide what I see. The algorithm that they produce, that their software engineers are writing, is deciding what I see. Like, it's not just people that I'm following. Right. And even if it is just people that I'm following, it's not like in just like a simple chronological order. They're deciding what to amplify and what not to amplify. And so they're a media company, just like CNN and Fox News are media companies. But there's one key difference. CNN and Fox and New York Times and everybody else is liable for the content on their platform. If they publish something that's, excuse me, if they publish something slanderous, or something false, right? They're liable for that, So, but the social media platforms are not, because of Section 230, and so that I think that's a big problem, and so I think that does need changing. I think the fact that the laws that govern social media were written in the mid 1990s. I mean, just think about that for a second. Section 230 was authored in the mid 1990s. And that's the law that governs social media today, which, by the way, means it's just an incredible failure on the part of our political leaders and the part of the U.S. Congress to regulate this stuff. But that's where things stand today.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. What are you kidding me?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CANWEGET20 for 20% off your first order, or hit the link in our show details. No, we've talked about Section 230 on here as somebody who's worked for some of these tech companies, so I apologize right there to you, Zachary. But you're right, though, the power of social media, right? That's how we found each other and some of the stuff you've been doing. And I want to give you a little bit of space here to talk a little bit more about PalestineNexus.com that I alluded to at the beginning of this show, and the site that you're working on, and everything that your site, the goals, aims that you have for this site. Take our audience a little bit inside of it.
I really appreciate that question. Palestine Nexus originated with my dissertation research. So I did my PhD on Palestine history, on the origins of a Palestinian identity in the late Ottoman period. And in the course of doing that research, I was very interested in especially maps, also documents and manuscripts and books, but particularly maps, because it is my view that to understand why people started to identify as Palestinian, you really need to trace the origins and development and spread of maps in the late Ottoman and Mandate periods. Because if you think about like Palestinian identity, you know, why is it that I identify with Palestine? I can't see Palestine; it's too big. You know, I need a map of it. That helps me visualize it. It helps me, gives me it gives me the sense that Palestine is real. And so, anyways, I was collecting all these maps for my research, and I started writing blog posts about them. And you know, people were reaching out to me, like, "Oh, I love that blog post." So I was like, "Okay, I think I struck a chord here." And so at some point, I was like, you know, I should just make all this stuff available. I'm done with my PhD. I'm not really actively using these maps. Let me just post it online. I created a website, Palestine Nexus, posted all the maps so anyone can download all the maps for free. It's probably about at this point, I don't know, maybe 500, maybe 1,000 maps, not just of Palestine, but of, you know, rare Ottoman maps. I'm kind of a collector of maps. So I've got all these maps I put up on the website. And then at some point it just expanded and I started adding more documents that I've collected over the years, historical documents related to Palestine and the Palestinians. I started adding manuscripts. I started adding digital copies of newspapers that I've collected over the years, again, mostly related to Middle East history. And then people actually started reaching out to me being like, hey, like friends and colleagues were like, hey, I have this collection of 10,000 documents from, you know, the British archives on Egypt during World War I. Do you want them? I was like, great, let's get them up there. And so I, you know, and then I have documents from Syria from the 1930s and 40s that another colleague shared with me. So there's just, now it's really kind of turned into almost a digital archive of maps and historical documents and newspapers and manuscripts. And that's kind of how it started. And at some point, I think this is just a few months ago, I decided to I decided to launch a newsletter. And so the newsletter itself is called Palestine in Your Inbox. And it's a weekly newsletter about all things Palestine, primarily history, but also politics, also culture. And so you can subscribe to the newsletter as well at PalestineNexus.com.
Yeah, most recently we saw the UN resolution, you know, that had condemned all the violence as it had spoken to, and the U.S. not vetoing that resolution. You know, from where you stand, you know, for the research you've done in this field, how does that make sense in the form of, and granted, the U.S. has said that we need to also recognize that like there's a problem here, things need to be done. But what was your take when what was your reaction when you saw that in terms of, you know, the U.S. just not willing to go along with what seemed to be like the rest of the world in recognizing the violence going on as related to both Hamas and Israel?
It was an unforced error. First of all, even if you don't want to vote for it, why don't you just abstain? I mean, that I don't understand that. I mean, I think that was a commentary that I completely agree with. A number of people shared that opinion. But look, I think what's happening in Gaza right now is absolutely atrocious. You have a food and water crisis. My Palestinian Gazan friends are texting me that they're drinking salt water. There's no fresh water. People don't have fresh water. They're drinking the salty water that comes out of the taps. Okay, and they're even lucky to have that. She's like, I'm a lucky one. Most of my friends don't have any water at all. And you're seeing posts of people. This one Palestinian Gaza Instagrammer was explaining how she had a backpack on. They were walking north, you know, fleeing from the north to the south, and a little kid grabbed a bottle of water from her and ran away. They're stealing water from each other because there's no water. I mean, this is a humanitarian catastrophe. People are going to die from dehydration in the coming days if water isn't allowed to enter the Gaza Strip. So Israel, I mean, if that's not genocide, you know, if starving 2.3 million people is not genocide, I don't know what is. And the Biden administration is refusing to call for a ceasefire. It's shameful. It's absolutely shameful. I'm speechless.
Well, Zachary, you know, before we let you go, I did want to follow up on that because as we're recording this, President Biden spoke to the American people from the Oval Office today. He said a couple of things in the speech there. I want to get your reaction on something that he said earlier tonight. Take a listen to this.
I also spoke with President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and reiterated the United States remains committed to the Palestinian people's right to dignity and to self-determination. The actions of Hamas terrorists don't take that right away. Like so many other, I'm heartbroken by the tragic loss of Palestinian life, including the explosion at the hospital in Gaza, which was not done by the Israelis. We mourn every innocent life lost. We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity.
All right, so Zachary, the question I have for you is, and the same thing that we asked Professor Waxman, where do we go from here? Because it looks like on the surface, President Biden is trying to play this center role as best as he can, showing that he can be an ally to Israel while also understanding the plight of Palestinians, maybe not through action. So where do we go from here? Because like you just said, you're talking to people on the ground that are running out of water. Israel has said that they are probably going to send ground troops in as of the latest reporting as we're recording this right now, which could be a huge humanitarian catastrophe. We've talked about ad nauseum of how Hamas hides in some of these areas where civilians are. So like it's so convoluted and messy. And the president is like of the United States, the leader of the free world, is here tiptoeing a line between an ally and also the plight of Palestinians that Hamas truly doesn't represent in the Western nation's eyes. So where do we go from here? Where do you see this shaking out over the next couple of months? A two-state solution, something. Give our people here a bit of hope that maybe there isn't in this hopeless situation.
I think the first thing to do is to call for an immediate ceasefire and to allow humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip before people starve to death and die from dehydration. That's like number one. There's a humanitarian crisis, and Israel still, to this day, as we're recording right now, has not allowed the humanitarian aid to enter. And there was a claim on the part of Israel that they started to allow water in, but you need electricity to pump the water to people's homes. So that was just PR. That was just nonsense. But I mean, ultimately, beyond the the immediate ceasefire and the opening of Gaza to humanitarian aid, this conflict needs a political solution. And so a ground invasion, Israel's gonna. What is that gonna do? I mean, it will kill more Israelis, that's for sure. It will kill more Palestinians, that's for sure. And then at the end of it, what have you achieved? You think you're going to eradicate Palestinian resistance to occupation and siege and ethnic cleansing? That's not going to happen. Violence breeds violence. Massive violence breeds massive violence. And that's why this attack was so gruesome. I mean, that's why Gazans carry out the atrocious attacks and West Banks carry out less atrocious attacks because there's more violence committed against Gazans than there's the West Bank. Violence breeds violence. Occupation breeds violence. Ethnic cleansing breeds violence. Siege and blockade breeds violence. So if you want to solve for the violence, you got to solve for the things that is leading to the violence, which is you need an end to the occupation. Israel has been militarily occupying the West Bank and Gaza for 56 years. That has to end. And the only way that's going to end is with sustained international pressure on Israel. And there has to be a political solution. You got to bring Palestinians and Israelis to the negotiating table, which hasn't been done now for nearly 20 years. The U.S. basically abandoned the Palestinians. Most of the world has abandoned the Palestinians. And so there's been, as has the rest of the Arab world, by the way, right? You had the Abraham Accords where, Qatar, UAE, Morocco, Sudan basically said, we'll normalize without any concessions made to the Palestinians. Now Saudi Arabia is saying more or less the same thing. We're going to normalize without any real concessions made to the Palestinians. But fundamentally, at the core of this conflict is a state of Israel, which controls all the land between the river and the sea. Within that state of Israel, there are 10 million Israelis and 5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. Altogether, we're talking 15 million people, okay? All 15 million people need equal rights. And until that happens, so long as you have 2 million people in Gaza and 3 million people in the West Bank who do not have political rights, who are not allowed to vote for the government that controls their lives, you're going to have violence. And so I think ultimately the solution, in my view, is that the international community and the U.S. in particular need to apply pressure on Israel to end the occupation and to stop ethnically cleansing Palestinians in Masaf Yatta and the Jordan Valley and in East Jerusalem, and to stop bombing Gaza and slaughtering innocent Gazan civilians. And I think that's kind of the starting point. And whether or not the international community is going to succeed at doing that, I think we probably all know the answer to that question already. There's no appetite in the U.S. for pressuring Israel. We just saw Biden say, we support Israel's right to defend itself. We are committed to Israel's defense. And at the same time, he's talking about helping Palestinians, but what has he done? Where's the humanitarian aid? It hasn't entered yet. Why not? So again, I think that the key, the key actors in this conflict are basically right now the United States and to some extent the European Union and to some extent the Arab world. And those actors need to apply a tremendous amount of pressure on Israel to stop the violence and stop the occupation. I think that's the starting point. And then you got to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together to a negotiation table and force them to come to an agreement, and not just some agreement 7 years in the future. Oh, we'll negotiate the final status issues. Oh, we'll deal with that later. No, there needs to be a president that shows up in Jerusalem and says, Bibi Netanyahu, you have 3 months to come to a political resolution. But without that, I don't see any way forward.
Zachary, I'm being honest when I say this, man, because like I said, as we've devoted more coverage to this and different segments to this and different people speaking perspectives, I love your voice, man, and I love the perspective historically and also present day that you've been able to give about the region overall. You can follow Zachary over on Twitter _Zach Foster. You can go check out his website, PalestineNexus.com. Can't thank you enough for hopping on the podcast with us and giving us a couple minutes. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.